The Dalai Lama once said that today, more than ever before, life must be characterized by a sense of universal responsibility, not only nation to nation and human to human, but also human to other forms of life. Join me in conversation with some of the world's most creative thinkers to explore the importance of ethics to this responsible decision-making in today's technologically infused world. Artists, entrepreneurs, scientists, journalists, academics, and beyond navigate the gray, the blend of right and wrong, of opportunities and risks on all sides of our most important challenges, whether gene editing, civilian space travel, or artificial intelligence. They also probe the age-old and more ethically black and white behaviors, such as sexual misconduct, human trafficking, and life-threatening inequality. Our guests endeavor to transcend religious, political, national, and ethnic perspectives, but recognize the inevitable biases we all bring. The term ethics can make us uncomfortable. At the Ethics Incubator, we confront the E word head-on. It may be inconvenient or even unclear, but ethical conundrums underpin almost every headline and affect almost every human choice. With truth under threat and the boundaries of humanity blurring, I believe that ethical decision-making tethers us to our humanity. As always, we welcome your thoughts. I'm delighted to be speaking today with Dacher Keltner. Dacher Keltner is a professor of psychology at the University of California, Berkeley, and the faculty director of the UC Berkeley's Greater Good Science Center. A renowned expert in the science of human emotion, Dr. Keltner studies compassion and awe, the topic for today, how we express emotion, and how emotions guide our moral identities and search for meaning. His research interests also span issues of power, status, inequality, and social class. He's the author of The Power Paradox and the best-selling book Born to be Good, and the co-editor of The Compassionate Instinct. His most recent book, Awe, is a national bestseller and will be the topic of our conversation today. It's a pleasure to welcome Dacher to the Ethics Incubator. So, Dacher, it'd be really great if we could just ground the conversation a little bit, that we'll focus a lot on your newest phenomenal book, Awe. But in your work generally, sort of how did you come to study awe? And can you tell us a little bit about the center at Berkeley that you run? A lot of this sort of scientific work behind spirituality and behind what I would just call humanness is happening.
Yes, for millennia, in almost every philosophical, ethical tradition, spiritual tradition, people have really thought of the emotions as being core to the human mind and consciousness and how we make sense of reality and comport ourselves in moral ways. You know, compassion, Karen Armstrong, the religious historian, says is kind of core to all the ethical traditions, spiritual traditions. I'm really an emotion scientist, and it has this lineage of David Hume and Aristotle and Charles Darwin, and then the contemporary science. And up until about 2000, we had largely focused on fight or flight emotions of anger, fear, disgust. You know, how to protect self-interest, and we forgot positive emotions. We forgot moral emotions like compassion. We forgot aesthetic emotions like awe and beauty. And so I got interested in this science of self-transcendent emotions. And they're fascinating because they're emotions that help us go beyond self-interest to care for others, like compassion, build up trading, reciprocal, reverential relationships, gratitude, and then awe. In around 2000, and started writing about awe with John Haidt first. And then, you know, alongside that science at UC Berkeley, we started the Greater Good Science Center. And the very simple idea is, you know, there was this movement of positive psychology, this new work on meditation, mindfulness, just exploding around the world. And we wanted to give it away to people, you know, give away, you know, thoughtful essays on things like gratitude or compassion, or we wanted to give it away to teachers, and also in the form of practices like, you know, how could I, if I'm really stressed out and I'm a medical doctor, how can I find some gratitude in 3 minutes during my busy day? And it's exploded, you know, with a podcast and a website that's read by millions, and and good outreach to school teachers, which I'm really proud of, educators.
I think it's, for me, this has always been a topic for family. We have a tradition in
Right.
our family about gratitude. We call it the grateful thing. It's really about saying something that we're grateful for before every meal, and it takes all of 30 seconds, but it's just a way to stop and pause. But let me focus on this word you just used, self-transcendent. And if we can talk about how you define awe,
Yeah.
because the definition was sort of rife with things we don't really understand, things that
Yeah.
are greater or bigger than we are. But I was particularly struck by this, that which is beyond our comprehension. If you can just talk a little bit about the definition and how you came to that.
I think there's a sense in psychological science, and this is an old idea, that, in my book, I write about this default self that I believe evolution created in humans to track your desires and your interests and your standing in social hierarchies, and, just to make sure you survive and do well and reproduce, et cetera. And it, people have called it the ego, the self, et cetera. And it's a loud voice in our minds of, are you doing your tasks? Are you on time? Do you make enough money? What do other people think of you? Familiar thoughts to many of us. But Susan, as you know, like there's a increasing consensus in a lot of different disciplines that, from evolutionary thinking to cultural psychology, that we're this hypersocial collective species. We form groups, we have cultural identities, we have aesthetic identities, political identities that are unlike anything you see in the mammalian world for the most part. And so we got to and one of the central challenges of our collectivity is not to be purely selfish and narrowly selfish, to give to others, to sacrifice, to benefit others, to serve others. And that's what these emotions, these self-transcendent emotions do. As they've moved through our mammalian evolution, compassion gets you to sacrifice for people in need, even non-kin, strangers, etc. Gratitude helps you, in your familial practice, helps you like sort of note what is sacred that unites the people that you're with. And then awe is really about connecting you to these large things out in the world, right? Ecosystems, cultural groups that are mysterious to us because we don't ordinarily think about them. We don't think about our embeddedness in big systems. So yeah, and what I love your observation, Susan, because awe is about mystery fundamentally. It's just like we have an emotion that's like, hey, that's mysterious, what do you think of it? And we try to figure it out. So that's what got us to this thinking of awe as a self-transcendent emotion.
I love the sort of sense that we don't know everything and we can't know everything, particularly in a world in which young people, I mean, you see it at Berkeley, I see it at Stanford, people think that so much information is at their fingertips that, and we'll come to the truth of that information a bit later in our discussion, but so much information is at their fingertips that they can kind of access everything, but it's just not true. It's really and so one of the things I love about the book is that it's sort of one of many ways that we're confronting this question of what it means to be human. But I want to come back to what you were talking about in terms of moral identities. Because I spent a lot of time looking at ethical decision making. And one of the problems with ethical decision making is that very often there isn't context, there isn't perspective. And they're two different things. But one perspective question is sort of, I talk a lot about the short, medium, and long-term perspective is just how far the implications of our decisions will ripple out. Sort of how, one way to put it is how contagious ethics is, how far it spread for the good or for the ill. But it seems to me that this whole notion of awe helps us put our ethical decisions into perspective. And I'm wondering if you can just talk a little bit about that.
You're capturing, I think one of the defining properties or essences of awe, and one of the primary functions for our minds. And we're just starting to actually gather data on that, which is to shift out of a narrow focus upon reality of sort of, short-term, immediate cause-effect relationships to like, wow, let's situate this phenomenon in a broader perspective, be it temporal, like history, spatial, whoa, that's the Earth in the solar system. And awe does that, it makes you realize, and it is this freeing from the default self, which is very narrowly focused on the present and linear cause-effect relationships, to, wow, you have an awe experience, and suddenly you're like, wow, I'm actually part of this passage of time, or I'm part of, I'm here in Berkeley, but actually Berkeley is part of, the California system or whatever. So I think in part what I write about in awe is the primary function there for the epistemological function or for knowledge is to remind ourselves that every phenomenon is located in systems, right? Big systems. So we have these awe experiences. I remember I had this fifth grade camping trip where I was at this state park near Mendocino, and the tide pools blew me away. And I would see little crabs crawl across the floor and realize, like, this is a whole society of species in this tide pool that's as big as a puddle, and that suddenly awakened me to systems of nature in oceans.
I'm
So
laughing because I think everybody who I grew up in roughly Northern California area, and everybody who did went to a tide pools field trip.
yeah, and the same is true of other experiences of awe. It gives us this, as you say, this bigger perspective on things. You have an awe experience listening to a particular kind of music, and I love asking people about this, and they suddenly, when they're moved to tears and they feel awe, they're like, oh, I get it. Like I love this choral music because it reminds me of my sense of, divinity, or how I would think about divinity with other people. So awe is one of the great emotions that liberates us to think big, right? To look at where things are in these different perspectives.
And that's one of the things that I found so fascinating about the book, because because we can have our own tide pools, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, it might be a family, it might be our school, it might be, a classroom at UC Berkeley for a period of time.
There's this thinking in the philosophy of science and cognitive science and philosophy of, like, there's this narrow analytical mode the mind could shift to of, like, okay, I'm breaking things into their pieces and looking how they all work together. And then we shift out to systems, like what is this little part of the cell doing within the context of the cell? Or what am I doing in the context of my family?
Mhm.
Or what is this political movement doing in the context of history, this broader system? And all keeps shifting us to that broader perspective, which you talked about, younger people today. I feel like, the technology, one of the failures of the smartphone is it's so narrow and analytical, and Google Maps points you to the most efficient route to point B, and we need this broader perspective. I'm sure you sense it in your students.
We need to be able to get lost, right?
Yeah.
It's
Yes.
better if we get lost than that every single time Google Maps takes us the most efficient way there. And one of
Yeah.
the problems with COVID was, it basically eradicated chance encounters. So I
Oh
do
my
a lot of
God.
work at the London School of Economics. It's a huge privilege, but one of the best things that happens is walking to a meeting there and never knowing whom I might bump into, because
Yeah.
it's a very small campus relative to a place like Berkeley. And it's fantastic, these what I'll call chance encounters. Part of systems too, right? I mean,
Yeah. Yep.
the surprises. You use a term that I'm wondering if it's an extension of systems or something completely different. That's this term collective effervescence.
Collective effervescence. There are certain kinds of feelings of awe that we've studied that happen when you're moving with other people, and they kind of are hard to describe. They kind of surprise us, and they're really powerful emotionally. So you might have it, when you're dancing with other people, right? You might have it when you're at a sporting event and you're cheering, and suddenly you're like loving the people around you. You might have it, there are actually studies of pedestrians in cities where they're walking along, and all of a sudden they start moving together when it's really crowded, and you feel like, wow, I'm part of this surge of culture or whatever. And Emile Durkheim, the great French sociologist, really felt that shared feeling you have when you move in unison with others is kind of the essence of religion. It's like we're all doing rituals together, we're chanting together, and it's about the feeling we have when we're moving in unison. And you're right, Susan, it is what it awakens you to is that I'm part of a social system. Like, oh my God, I'm a fan of, this football, Arsenal or what have you, and it matters to me. It has this almost moral component to it because it's collective. And so, what I love about collective effervescence is, the obvious stuff is like, oh, music and dance, et cetera. But, like it speaks to why sports are so important to us.
Mhm.
if you're a Red Sox fan, that year they beat the Yankees, when you all cheered with other people, that was one of the most important moments in your life, right? Because the emotion made you realize I'm part of this tribe.
Right.
And it is about locating the self in a system.
I just had the privilege of speaking at the opening of the World Games for Special Olympics.
Nice.
And that was a
Congratulations.
moment for me of collective effervescence. I mean, this was such an extraordinary group of young people, some of whom live with intellectual disabilities, some of whom are their partners who do not. And it was an extraordinary moment. And it was all about sports. And at the same time, it was not at all about sports. So I really, I just let me switch gears a little bit and ask
Sure.
you about a personal obsession, and that is about truth. The concept of truth comes out a lot in the book. The concept of truth is everywhere around us, including the fact that, for example, Chat GPT doesn't know what's true or false, and quite authoritatively spews a lot of falsity or a lot of inaccuracy. What is the relationship between truth and awe, if any?
William James wrote about this, and it's a terrific question, and you're one of the first to really, probe that. James noted, and this has influenced a lot of the study of mystical experience, and then by implication, awe as well, because James had a lot to say about awe. And what he observed is, across religious traditions, this is in the Varieties of Religious Experience, early 1900s. He said, these mystical experiences where you feel conversion, a sense of conversion, which you could think about, QAnon and conspiracy theories or political conversion, have this sense of what he called noetic quality of like, this is true. When people do spirit medicines or psychedelics, they definitely are like, oh, I suddenly am seeing reality for what it is. And awe has that feeling to it. You really feel like, in part because of the process we've started to chart here, which is you see something about reality you don't understand. So you really work hard to understand it, and pow, you see it. Wow, all living forms are animated by mitochondria or whatever it is. I think for the most part, this is a tough empirical question. I don't know if it's an empirical question. Awe gets it right. Most of the time it's like, oh, now I understand what form of morality I care about through my reactions to music. But it can be led astray. It can be manipulated for sure. And, you think about cult leaders and the wild-eyed awe that people feel for QAnon, and conspiracy theories have that quality of like, I can put all these observations into one system and blow your mind. Like, oh my God, it all started in that pizza parlor. And so, I think John Haidt really got it right when thinking about the moral emotions or self-transcendent emotions like awe, which is they point us towards some sense of truth, and then social discourse has to, and reason. We have to like debate, as that's what you do. And so we need both.
That's interesting, because one of the things that comes up a lot in discussions I have is the difference between subjective and objective truth. And your work as a scientist starts with data, right? Which sort of lends itself to this sense of this is true. I mean, one of the things that struck me about especially aesthetic awe, how do you know what's true about this mountain or this cathedral we saw this terrible tragedy with Notre Dame in Paris. Now we're seeing it being put back together, and in a strange sort of way, we're seeing the truth of this place in a way that we never would have. And so this whole process that's another place where I'm seeing a lot of awe and collective effervescence, by the way.
Yeah, Pier Carlo Valdesolo has a nice study on that, really elegant, that momentary feelings of awe, I start to see patterns in random sequences of digits. And most people immediately extend that to like, oh, feelings of awe, suddenly like, I kind of like that conspiracy theory or whatever the case may be. It's a complicated issue, but I think that, part of what awe does in these different domains like aesthetics, which you referred to, is it says there are multiple perspectives upon any phenomenon. And I have this feeling of truth in the moment about what this painting tells me about war, right? Or whatever the case may be, or torture. And now I have to grapple with it, right? I just feel it's fundamentally true. And hopefully society has the mechanisms to democratically negotiate what we think to be true.
Right. And my truth isn't necessarily the truth. or at the very
Yeah,
least,
and we get confused.
yeah, my truth isn't necessarily everybody else's truth. I'd like to broaden the lens a little bit and talk about academic institutions. What is your take on the whole free speech environment in academic institutions, and just where students and faculty are today on free speech?
I am struck by, the need for open discourse. Yeah, and then at the same time, at UC Berkeley, we had this horrible free speech week led by Milo Yiannopoulos, and then
Right.
all the clowns came in. And I think that, what I heard the younger generation say is, free speech is wonderful. That's what this institution's about. But I think we need, in light of the new technologies, digital representations of speech and the like, and Twitter, that we need to take seriously harmful speech. And it's just changed, and I saw it that week. And so that served as a temper for me, just in the abstract, that, yeah, free speech is good, debate is good, but we also have to think about historical harm and the harm to individuals, which is now different when you call somebody out on Twitter and they find your address and then you're exposed. Mm-hmm. So that really humbled me in my commitment to open discourse.
So academic institutions are perhaps a special animal,
yeah,
and a particular environment in which we need to be particularly attentive to free speech.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean that we can't also be attentive to respect.
I agree. No.
But I think your point about technology is really important. And I think in a way we need to be a bit awestruck by the potential positive and negative of technology, and by the fact that we are still very confused about what free speech means in this technologically infused world. It's a very different thing even from, say, 10, 15, 20 years ago.
Well, at the Free Speech Week here at Berkeley, I went to all the events. I actually saw all the protests, went to the law school debates, and I was like, I really talk to my friends, I believe in free speech and peer review and open discourse, et cetera. And then, the new forms of harm that come out of it are really categorically different. Like, people can find your address and harass you. And a lot of, and that's happening a lot. But at the same time, I worry a bit about the abandoning of evidence in the discourse. And, I'm in a scientific discipline, and with peer review built into it.
And reproducible.
Yeah, so we take that really, and so we're working on it, and we know about all the biases. But so I worry about the kind of the default claim, like everything is constructed. But I also think it's so complicated. It's a moment where power structures are shifting, and we have to let these new voices make their case, and then arrive at a new set of principles for free speech, which I think is where we are.
Academic institutions are very specific places with a particular responsibility to protect free speech.
Yeah, I agree.
And I think that free speech is critical, even geopolitically. If we look at authoritarian regimes, what do? They control a narrative, very much by falsity. I think we need free speech to even confront the sort of falsity of the chat GPT phenomena. But I also, and just to maintain some sense of, how we connect with each other. And I guess the most fundamental level, to say that truth matters.
Yeah, I agree. And, it's fascinating. And facts, and there are things that are almost like facts that we can trust. Like, if you lock somebody up in solitary confinement, that person will likely suffer deeply. That's a fact.
Right.
I think it's the next 10, 15 years. I think we're at this shift with respect to technology, with the faking of imagery, and then ChatGPT, like you're saying. I think there's going to be this. I think there's this public awareness that a lot of these sources of information we used to trust wholeheartedly are degraded, and so it's going to be an interesting time.
One of the things about that struck me with your book is that it really is about this question of what it means to be human, and therefore what it means to be real. Is this a real, Rembrandt painting or not? A real Taylor Swift song or not? But we've gotten very lazy. We've gotten to a point where convenience really matters. But the truth can be, as Al Gore said, incredibly inconvenient.
Yeah.
So when you talk about people saying, "Oh, well, science is all fake, all made up," or that's it, That's because a lot of times people don't like what science tells us.
Yeah.
Really what they don't like is what we have to do about what science tells us.
Yes.
Like, we don't want to wear masks, don't want to, not use plastic. We don't want to turn the air conditioning off. So I think there's a little bit of that also, and but it's a very complicated time.
Well, and it's so interesting because, awe plays a role in a lot of this. Awe is very, political theorists now are starting to get interested in like social movements like QAnon that emerge out of awe and this collective effervescence. Easy to imagine nonviolent political protests, stuff that's viral. Jonah Berger finds on the internet, New York Times stories tend to have some awe and mystery in them. And you're raising, I think, a really deep question, Susan, which is does awe have a truth detection mechanism in it? I feel like it does, but readily exploited, and you can imagine historical veins of exploitation. So we'll see. Yeah. and I love your idea as well of like, we feel awe towards painting and music and so forth, but what if it's not? What if it's produced by a machine, or it's fake? Maybe it doesn't produce awe.
What is it that produces awe? Is it the
Yeah.
fact human being produced it, or is the fact that it's just this incredible painting, even if it was generated by some machine?
Yeah.
I'd like to turn to a little bit personal.
Sure.
You talk a lot in the book about family loss,
Mm.
sort of how that got your thinking started, and a lot of people
Mm-hmm.
have been through that. And I wondered if you would talk a little bit about that, and then
Mm.
also if you would talk a little bit about what is the most difficult ethical dilemma you've ever faced personally.
I had a really unusual childhood, and most people might think they have an unusual childhood, but I definitely did. I was born in Mexico and raised early in my childhood in the late 60s in Laurel Canyon, kind of a wild place. And then my parents moved us to this poor rural town when we were 10, and kind of, wandered in this rural experiment, wandered the foothills of the Sierras and so forth. And I shared my childhood with my brother Rolf, and he and I did everything. We had this like just awe-inspiring childhood. Free and roamed and skateboarded and jumped in wild rivers, and he was my companion in awe. And then he got colon cancer and died 4 years ago, over 4 years ago, and it was brutal to watch him near death, and then it was transcendent to watch him pass away. A lot of people have awe experiences watching babies be born and watching people die. It just presents this
You talk a lot in
mystery.
the book, yes, about awe and life cycle.
Yeah, and the cycle of life. And you're watching someone die, and you're touching them, and you're just like, what is life? What is this? And what happened to me is it just was in this perpetual state of mystery, confusion, anxiety, grief. Like, what is the point of life? How will I make sense of the world with my brother gone? And I went in search of awe, and because I knew about the health benefits of awe. It's good for your heart, your immune system, your mind, your meaning making. And I was like, man, I'm blown off the map. I just got to go to mountains and talk to spiritual leaders and go listen to music and dance in big things. And it changed my life, just like, this is what I really am here to do in the world. And it also, Susan, I'm a more of a biologically reductionistically oriented scientist, but I was like, there's a lot of stuff about life and death we don't know. There are dimensions to reality we can't grasp. So who knows? And it opened me up to a different way of thinking about my brother's place in my life now, which I'm grateful for. And what it's been interesting, our culture, US, lots of Western European cultures don't deal with death well. We don't have a language for it. We don't have a sense of like, why is it so transcendent? And awe is one way to think about it. And I've just been involved in so many great conversations, people writing me like, I lost my brother. It changed my life. And now I kind of get a sense of what got me to a better sense of living. So it was transformative to be able to talk about the science and everybody's wisdom about awe, and also this personal transformation.
My second question is just sort of as we draw the conversation to a close, just some broader questions about ethics. And it was
Yeah, that's right.
what is the biggest, what was the most challenging ethical dilemma you've ever faced personally?
I think in some ways, like, there's the personal stuff, you know, that, um, should I behave in this way in a romantic relationship? But I think I've been involved in a couple that where I really feel like I misfired or had the wrong intuitions, and now I'm really revising, and it has to do, believe it or not, with what indigenous peoples call spirit medicines or psychedelics.
Hmm.
You know, and um, Michael Pollan publishes the book, How
Right.
to Change Your Mind. It is a cultural sensation. There are all these centers popping up, and for Berkeley as a center, there's work going on at Stanford, Johns Hopkins, NYU, Harvard, blah blah blah. It's all over. Uh, Tens of millions of people. I mean, psychedelic use is up 50%. People are microdosing and doing all kinds of crazy stuff. And it's interesting, Susan. Like, and I think this is what's interesting about ethical dilemmas we're part of. Is like you often don't know you're part of one. And when the movement first started happening again, the Renaissance, if you will, I was like, well, it helped me when I was a teenager, psychedelics, spirit medicines, psilocybin, etc. I think they're good for a lot of social conditions, I'm facing death, trauma. Maybe it'll help decriminalize drugs, which I work in prisons. 30% of people in there are there for drugs, which is and their race. I was like, that's all good. And all of us, and I was like, I was a little bit bold, like, let's champion this, and this is good. And I'm part of this university and this center. And now I'm looking at how it exploits indigenous peoples, and billions of dollars are at stake, and capitalism is running roughshod over things, with, patents and drugs. And then I look at the problems of microdosing, which I think are going to be significant. And I'm like, oh man, I better back up and adopt an ethical perspective on this.
Interesting.
And yeah, and so it's been interesting, like, because I get to speak about this, 500 medical doctors who are like, we got to know, and I've changed my tune and feel like I made some mistakes on that. And it is a personal one in some sense. My daughters are curious about it, a lot of friends, and I think I've revised how I think about it because of ethical consideration.
So I think it's an interesting example because it's something that, again, is an example of ethics being contagious
Oh my God.
for the
Oh my
good or
God.
the ill. But I often say to people, I focus a lot in ethical decision making on banishing binary thinking. I don't think this is all good or all bad. I think the question, and it's the question I always ask with students, it's the question I ask with clients, it's the question I ask in my own work. It's not yes or no, it's when and under what circumstances. So,
Thank you.
maybe we need to get a handle on the circumstances. We need to get
Yeah.
a handle on who. We need to get a handle on where people are obtaining these things, because we can decriminalize drugs, but criminals are often involved in them. The
Yeah.
fact that people can be exposed to criminal elements in trying to obtain them, the fact that people don't really fully understand them, and the fact that we're in this culture that we talked about earlier of convenience and high speed, everything because of technology. People aren't going to sit and read. I always laugh now when I pull the piece of paper out of, for example, a bottle of aspirin, and you
Yeah.
unravel it, or a COVID test, and it's this long and this wide, and it's in 12 languages, and it's in microprint. And I don't even have the patience to read and say, am I going to wait 3 minutes or 4 minutes and put the blue top or the red top? And I'm thinking the average person is
Yeah.
not going to do this, right? But there aren't even any pieces of paper around some of this stuff. So I think that's a great example, a really great example.
Thank you. Yeah, and I love your deeper analysis of it, because like there I was, this naive Berkeley professor, and I have 400 people in my happiness class. One of the days I talk about psychedelics, I know my students are sharing it, and it's on all these digital platforms, and next thing you know, 8,000 people, have this message, and they're sharing it, and oh, the Berkeley guy, and it's like, so we have to. It's one of the meta themes of our conversation, like, these new digital viral forms, we gotta think carefully about them.
Is there anything I didn't ask you about that I should have, or anything you'd like to say about the book? I'm going to make another plug for the book. I've made plugs for this book all over the place. I think it's one of the
Thank
best
you.
I've read in a long time.
Thank
And
you.
I
That's
think
really
it's a
nice.
really accessible book. You've done a phenomenal job of taking your, very academic research and making it accessible and enjoyable.
One of the things that people often ask me and is like, and this is, is well, how do I find it? If it's so good for you. And we have a lot of good research. We've just published a paper, a minute of awe a day, or a couple of minutes a day, leads medical doctors and nurses during COVID to feel less stressed and anxious as they dealt with that pandemic. And I always tell people, really, and this came out of my grief and what I did, which is pause, wander, like you said, wonder, embrace mystery, just a moment or two a day. And then, in the book, I write about the 8 wonders, and we've touched upon them, that give us all moral beauty of people, collective effervescence, nature, music, art, visual art, spirituality, and then life cycles, like you said, and big ideas. And just, give yourself a couple of minutes a day of that. And the book has ways to do that. And I think it's needed for our times.
No, I think it's definitely needed for our times. And I think I think it's always been needed, but it's one of those threads that you mentioned history that I can't think of, you could go as far back as possible and as far into the future as possible. And the
Yeah.
more technologically dominated we get, the more we need that. Thank you so, so much. I mean, your
Oh,
work is just phenomenal, and it's really been great fun speaking to you. And I really appreciate you taking the time.
amazing conversation, Susan. Thank you so much.